I am Ali Tayak. I am a Filipino American and I'm fluent in Tagalog. I think for me, it's just been able to help me communicate to all the people in my family regardless of like where they're from. So I kind of have that connection to them in the sense that if I go to the Philippines or if I go to visit family somewhere else, I can kind of talk to them in our own language. I like that connection that we form. A lot of people that I do know do not speak Tagalog, and like that's not something that they look down or I look down upon them on or anything like that. It just kind of helps me be able to communicate to my family. But if I didn't speak Tagalog, I think that it wouldn't necessarily like damper any relationships I have just because they all also know to speak English. If I do find myself in a situation where I'm not able to or they're not able to, then it just makes that situation easier. Also for me, like I don't look like a normal Filipino person, so a lot of the time people are not going to think that I am. Like I've gone to like Asian American convenience store and like most of the time they wouldn't guess that I'm Filipino. And for me, I don't know, it's not like a huge deal and it doesn't really bother me because I know like my own culture and I'm kind of proud of that. I don't think that language is the primary kind of factor to like being an authentic Asian American or whatever it is. A lot of it is just kind of embracing your culture. Like especially like growing up in the States, you do have to kind of assimilate in that sense where like you have to kind of still follow like Western norms or whatever it is. But each family and like the people you surround yourself with, they can definitely still help you like develop your own culture, and each person like practices their own different traditions. So I feel like authenticity is honestly like it is gonna vary per person. Like for me, it just kind of means that like I'm proud of like who I am and the culture that I have. I'm not necessarily bashing on it or like not like respecting it in a sense. I feel like you're just kind of authentic if you like pride yourself on who you are and like what culture you identify yourself with. What I find interesting is that when I go to the Philippines, I have like cousins and like family there that like don't even speak Tagalog. So honestly now like even the schools that they have there, they're going to be teaching you English, and you take like Tagalog lessons, but you don't necessarily need to be super fluent or know how to speak. And actually my dad's language or dialect, I don't speak that. It's called Kapampangan. So like when we go to his place in his home, a lot of the time his family or whatever is going to like talk to each other in that language because that's their primary language, and they make jokes or like tell stories and sometimes in Kapampangan, and I feel like we lose the kind of connection in that translation that they like have to make for us, or like when they have to like retell a story. I feel like in that sense sometimes it's hard, but you can still get by without knowing the language and be entirely authentic on your own. For me at least, it's like the food and being able to kind of enjoy that. There's plenty of like Filipino food that like I love so much, and I feel like that attaches me so much to my own culture, and like one day I definitely want to learn how to make that. So I personally do not think that I've kind of had a weird like identity crisis with being Asian American or Asian as well as like growing up in America. I think that's a lot because I did grow up in the States, and I feel like I kind of am able to be like socially cognizant of all the different norms and such that we have here. But at the same time, like I go back to the Philippines like pretty often, so in that sense I still kind of feel attached to that side, and I never felt a battle between like trying to choose between the two different cultures or anything like that. I think in regards to how other Asian Americans view me, in a sense, like because I'm able to like speak the language and basically communicate with other people through that, I feel like by their standards I kind of honestly feel like more impressive to them because I'm able to speak and because I grew up here. Because I feel like amongst the people that I've like met, like it's not a very common thing, and when they are able to speak, like people my age, I feel like very like connected to them, I would say. But I don't think it's necessarily like looked down upon or you look too Americanized if you like don't know how to speak Tagalog, just because it's not like super common of a thing, especially within people that grow up here. I personally feel like just because in a sense like definitely like all of my grandparents and stuff know how to speak like numerous different languages, and I feel like in their eyes like they made the attempt to like learn this language just for them though, because they like had to learn how to speak English because that's kind of where society is like moving towards. And if they want to expand to move to the States or like develop their own future here, then they definitely have to like learn that language. But for us, it's kind of like I didn't necessarily need to learn Tagalog. Like, it's just kind of like, I don't really use it in day-to-day life. Like, I know how to speak, but it's not something that was a necessity for me. I personally think that, like, the generation, like, whether you're first gen, second gen, whatever it is, that, like, that also honestly, like, plays key into how you, like, how important you find, like, learning the language is. I just know, like, just kind of from personal experience, like, a lot of my friends or whatever, if they're not first generation, then they won't necessarily, like, even their parents won't really necessarily know the language, and that's, like, entirely fine. They still know the culture based off of, like, food, like, traditions, like, dance, whatever it is. Like, they still kind of practice those things, but they just don't know the language, and I think that's entirely okay. A big thing that I kind of want to implement in my own kids, like, as I get older, or, like, when I, like, have children, is that I, like, still teach them, like, what I know of my culture through the language or the food or whatever it may be, just because I still think it's very important to still identify with the culture that you are, despite where you grew up. So for me, like, that's honestly, like, a thing that I kind of am worried about, just because now that I have grown up in the States and I don't go to the Philippines that often, I don't super identify the Philippines, like, as my home. I'm scared that I'm gonna, like, lose touch of that when I, like, have my own kids, and that's something that I would want to, like, implement in them. So basically, whenever I go back to the Philippines, it's, like, one of those things where, like, every single time they still, like, they talk to you in English, like, right off the bat, because they know that, or I mean me in English, because, like, right off the bat they know that I'm from here. And they don't typically expect us to be able to still know Tagalog. But then when me and my sister, for example, respond in Tagalog, they're like, oh, like, you still know how to speak, blah, blah, blah. And then, but even after that, like, the conversation just tends to stay in English. Just because, like, there was that moment of, like, oh, like, they actually do still understand, but they're just still trying to make it easier for me. Which I do appreciate, but at the same time, like, I can still, like, get along well, or, like, make conversation well and stuff like that, and, like, understand jokes in Tagalog. What I think is super interesting, or, like, what I, like, kind of enjoy about it is that I never remember learning how to speak. Like, I just know that, like, from when I was a kid, like, I've just known how, which I think is super helpful, because, like, I feel like learning a language in itself is just very hard. So when you learn it when you're younger, it just kind of comes naturally, I would say. But I don't think my parents ever gave us, like, an explanation or kind of, like, enforce, like, oh, you should speak Tagalog. Like, whenever, actually, it's, like, kind of me and my sister, like, when we just went to the Philippines this summer, I, like, was telling my parents, like, oh, like, I want to be able to practice this. Because, like, for me, like, I think it's super important and I value it. But I think that is kind of through what they've taught me, not necessarily, like, directly, but just about my own culture.
My name is Sarah Chi, and I'm a second-generation Korean American. I wanted to learn Korean because my parents and my grandparents on both sides speak it. One of my grandparents, I can't communicate with them because we can't understand each other because they don't know any English. It's just something I wanted to learn so I can be able to, like, know their story and just be able to, like, get to know them. It's only affected me during, like, family gatherings or, like, when I meet extended family, because they're just like, oh, you can't speak Korean. Just like that subtle, like, disappointment, like, oh, you should be able to know this, but you don't. So not knowing Korean has not impacted the way that I see myself, because I just don't think about that often. It affects, like, the way I think that other people see me, like my mom's friends who are Korean and stuff like that. But for me, it doesn't really affect how I see myself. So one of my mom's friends tried to teach me how to speak Korean, but, like, after a couple of weeks she gave up because she was just like, this is too hard, because, like, I didn't know how to learn, she didn't know how to teach, I guess. And then just the past summer, I tried to learn online through, like, podcasts and, like, websites and, like, YouTube videos, and I kind of learned, but, like, I didn't really commit to it consistently, so I know, like, very elementary basics of the language. If I get the chance, I'll definitely look into taking classes for the language, but as of right now, I'm just, like, casually learning through online mediums. Yeah. If Davis taught Korean, I would maybe take a class or two to learn some stuff. Okay, so the challenges for me that I think for learning a new language Okay. Well, I was challenged by like the grammar and like the rules of language because there's a lot of like exceptionals. And I think that just like persevering, because if you want to learn anything, you have to be persistent in it, and I did not have the persistence to continue learning. I would go to that study place every day after school for at least 3 hours, and that was when I realized that I met a lot of other Korean American girls and boys who were like my age, and I realized, oh my gosh, they all know how to speak Korean except me. So that was where I started to question, like, oh, I should learn Korean too because they all know it. All of those experiences and just like being like excluded out of like this language, this like cultural group, just made me realize that like it should be my duty to learn the language so I could be able to communicate with other people who are from, I don't know, who were like the same ethnicity as me. Well, in elementary school, most of my friends were like from diverse backgrounds, so I never felt like the pressure to learn my language because most of them did not know their own native language. But then, I guess like with family, with my grandparents, I wanted to learn Korean after trying to speak with them because I had no ways of communicating with them. So probably family and that tutoring center were my biggest reasons for wanting to learn Korean. I don't think certain qualities make someone more Asian than another person. Because right now I'm only thinking of like stereotypes, like Asian stereotypes, and that just because you have those stereotypes doesn't mean you're any more authentic. I mean, I was always raised believing that if you were of Asian descent and you were born in America, then you were automatically Asian American. Like no matter what languages you knew or like what your experiences were, it was just like in your DNA. You were just labeled by Nixon. You're an Asian American. I mean, I don't know my own language, but I think I'm an authentic Asian American. I think just being real and being who you are makes everyone authentic. I do not agree that language is like the set marker for Asian authenticity because, okay, just personally, since I don't know my own language, that just puts me in a more biased perspective that we don't need to, it's not a requirement to know your language before you're considered an authentic Asian American. Maybe in other people's eyes, they'll see me as more authentic than others, but in my own eyes, I don't. In certain societies, like the Korean, I guess like in the Korean, what do you call it? In the Korean American community, knowing Korean makes you more authentic. But in my own family, I think I'm just as authentic as they are, so I don't worry about that too much. For me, I wanted to learn my Korean strictly because of being able to understand what my family was saying to me. So I have an older sister and she's deaf. So after she was born, my parents decided not to confuse her or my siblings about learning a new language. So everything in the house was spoken in English so that she would grow up learning how to speak one language properly and that she wouldn't confuse any of us. So because of that, I always understood that the only language, English was the only language in the house. And even if when we went outside, like to family gatherings or to like places where Korean was spoken, it never seemed like a problem to me because I grew up learning English only. And in my parents' eyes, that was perfectly fine. And with my siblings, that was perfectly fine. Okay. Because language is like culture, and culture, as I'm learning right now, is very fluid. And I guess some communities tie language with being an authentic member of the community. Like language is with you all the time. It's not something like you wear like a festival or like a dance. Language is like everything. And I think that communities relate that everything to your identity, and that equates to authenticity. Everyone has their own story and everyone has their own reasons. So just to judge someone because they don't know how to speak their native language, I just think that you should people, instead of making these quick judgments about other people and their background, it's a very like one-dimensional thing. So I think judging people on their capability of speaking a language separates people within their own communities or ethnic communities. a problem per se, as it just like excludes people. Like my Korean heritage will always be a part of me. But I don't think there's like a clear like 50-50 Korean American side. I think you can like fuse the two together. Like some Korean ways of thinking and habits influence me, and some like American perspectives and like ways of thinking influence me. I've always thought your heritage, if you had like Korean heritage, that was enough. But I guess like if you want to be considered more Korean, you would have like the culture within you, like the language, the food, the music, etc. I think anyone with like heritage from a certain country is already authentic. But I think you can be more authentic if you like know the culture too.
My name is Caitlin Liu. I'm a first year here at UC Davis, and I am Chinese American. I do not speak a second language. My dad does speak a second language. He speaks Toisan. It's a dialect of Chinese. And on my mom's side, they speak Cantonese, but my mom does not speak, but her parents do. I would like to learn how to speak either Cantonese or Toisan, just because I feel like sometimes there's a language barrier between some of me and my family. But for the most part, everyone does speak English, and I haven't really needed to learn because my grandparents also speak English. By not speaking my language, I guess people would view me as really Americanized. I do still hold on to Chinese traditions and values, but because I don't speak Chinese, people would say that I'm less traditional. I think that is true in some sets, but in social settings, I guess it does put me apart from others. Like, I can't speak very well to my roommate, for instance, because she's from China, but I would like to learn so I could have conversations with her. So by not speaking Cantonese or Toisan, I guess it does kind of, there is a disconnect between me and my heritage, but I still identify as Asian. I wouldn't say I identify as fully American, but some days in just like some settings I feel more Asian and I feel more American. I don't know. I personally identify as Chinese American, but I do know some people who will only identify as Chinese even though they have maybe moved here or were born here, and I guess that's just because, you know, the culture is more intertwined with their family. For me personally, like, my parents cannot cook Chinese food, so it's not something that we can bond over. I think whether or not you speak the language, it doesn't matter in your authenticity of being Asian, because I am Asian and I'm not anything else. And I think that language just plays a role in being connected to everyone. For example, my grandma can speak Mandarin, Cantonese, and Toisan, so she's able to speak to basically 3 different types of Chinese people. Whether it's me, I can only speak to people who are bilingual and speak Chinese and English. I don't think I've really ever felt the need to identify with being simply Asian or simply American. I think that now it's just a part of who I am because I am both. I think other people would disagree that being able to speak or not to speak a language does determine your authenticity in being Asian, because language is kind of a tradition that you have to carry on throughout the next generation. For example, Toisan, the language, is becoming extinct because less and less people are speaking it, and supposedly, like, my duty is to carry that on, but I have not done a good job of it because I have not learned how to speak it. I guess cultural authenticity is determined by ultimately yourself and just your everyday practices and habits, and definitely the area you live in and the people you're surrounded by. I think on the spectrum of being more Asian or less Asian, I think it comes down to how much like tradition, language, and the culture plays into your everyday life. I think that society has a stereotypical view of Asians in general. Like, we're typically like really studious. We might have like glasses and just like the way the media depicts us, but I don't think that determines, you know, like whether you're more Asian or less Asian. I think being Asian American is just really about still being tied to your culture in a new context. Yeah, because like if you were an international student like living in America, then I think you would still identify just as Chinese because you don't know if this is going to be temporary or permanent. But I think if you were born here like me, and my parents were also born here, I think over time identifying as Chinese American just becomes like a new definition. Like personally, I've been judged just by the way I talk and the fact that I don't speak a second language. At my school that was predominantly Asian, I would be disincluded from group projects because they didn't think that I could contribute an equal amount because I was seen as less intelligent and less smart. Like, I don't know, it's just messed up. Like, yeah, like less culturally in tune meant that I was less intelligent. So they did not want me to be a part of their group projects. I don't want to say that a large part of Asian American culture in America has been based on stereotypes, but in a way it is just because of the way that the media portrays us, like in TV shows and movies. Isn't like the word Asian like just like kind of a label? It is a label, like because it like encompasses like everyone. There's an expectation of me as a Chinese American to excel academically and to get a good job and just to live an economically prosperous life. But I am a humanities major right now, and within my family and across Asians that I know, everyone's typically been STEM oriented. When some of my family members like ask me what I'm majoring in and what I want to do with my life, like I personally want to be a teacher. They just kind of look at me like they're disappointed because it's expected of me to major and pursue something STEM oriented. Yeah, I have felt pressured to learn the language. Even my parents even felt pressured to teach me the language when my mom couldn't even speak it herself. They placed me in Chinese school when I was in elementary school, and I only went for a year and I didn't really like it, so I stopped learning. It's such an important part of our culture. I guess the outside pressures would just be my grandparents and other members of the family that also speak it. A majority of my family does speak it, but my brother and I don't. I have never felt the need to learn Toisan or Cantonese outside of Chinese school because when I went to Chinese school, it was to learn Cantonese, but to learn Toisan is basically impossible if you don't have family members that speak it because Toisan, the village, doesn't exist anymore. There's not people proactively learning the language generation after generation in China.
Hi, I'm Joan Ashby. I'm a first year. I'm half British/European and half Malay with a little bit of Chinese. I speak Spanish and I used to speak Malay, Fuchao, and Iban, which is a tribal Malaysian language when I was little, but I don't anymore. I can kind of understand Fuchao vaguely, but not enough to get me around. I feel like I probably should become more fluent because my family speaks it, so when I go back, they also speak English, but when I go back home, they'll switch, or to Malaysia, they'll switch between Malay and Fuchao and Iban and English, so following their conversations is a lot harder, but I probably won't because it's a lot of work. Not knowing Fuchao combined with the fact that I'm mixed makes them view me a lot differently. When I go to Malaysia, I'm treated different because I'm half white. I think that I identify more with my Asian heritage just because like also growing up I did know Malay and Fuchao and stuff like that, so it was easier for me to talk to my family when I was little. Now I don't and it's harder, but at the same time I still can talk to them because they all speak English. I'm just used to that family more and I'm more comfortable with them. I probably wouldn't be as close with my mom's family if I didn't know when I was little because my great grandma speaks basically like no English whatsoever, so it was the only way we could talk to one another. The whole thing with being an authentic Asian, it just depends because being Asian itself is very diverse because you can be like Indian or Chinese. So like I guess it just depends on your culture and if you follow Asian culture or not, but also there's various types of Asian cultures, so it's kind of confusing. Well, also going back to the fact that I'm half white, like when I talk to my cousins, they're like, oh, you're not really Asian, and I'm like, well, yes, I am, because I still have that half of me that's like grown up with Asian culture and understands it, so I feel like I'm Asian. Someone who grows up around Asian culture and like understands it, not necessarily speak the mother tongue, I feel like it would be more useful, but I feel like authentic Asian and I don't speak the mother tongue. When I was little, I was like the only mixed kid in like my school. Even up until high school, there was nobody in my school who was mixed other than like my sisters and I like wouldn't acknowledge my Asian culture as much as I did now, just because I didn't have as much pride for it. I don't really know why, but I mean, like, I embrace it now. I love being Asian. My town's a little bit racist, so like being an Asian American wasn't necessarily a good thing. And I never got bullied, but my older sister would get teased for being Asian. So I would just try to like ignore the fact that I was actually Asian until like high school. After first grade, I stopped speaking Fuchao or Malay just because I thought it was like weird almost. I'd stop like eating Asian food just because like it didn't go with what everyone else was doing. I think at some point I'm gonna try to relearn Malay or Fuchao. My older sister, who doesn't speak Malay or Fuchao anymore, is learning Mandarin and Fuchao for college courses just for fun at UCSD. So I feel like at some point I'm gonna get back into it and like relearn. And like when I go back to Malaysia, I could like travel on my own. Like from my family, I do get like pressured to be like, Joan, why don't you speak Fuchao anymore? Like you spoke it when you're little. Why did you stop? Type thing. But like from society itself, my friends have never been like, oh, it's weird that you're Asian, but you don't speak Chinese.
My name's Gilbert Sui. My parents are from Hong Kong, and my grandparents are from Hong Kong. They speak Cantonese. Although I do not speak either Mandarin or Cantonese fluently, I can kind of understand Cantonese and understand Mandarin to the point where I can converse with someone. It's more that my parents raised me by speaking English more than Cantonese. My grandparents wouldn't because they didn't know English, but my parents knew English, so they would try to raise me into a life of English first, since I'm being raised in America. I think my parents raised me more like that, more just to fit in, I think. They want me to learn English just to fit more in the school system, maybe not have me go through more troubles that I might have to go to if I was an international student. If I was to be motivated to learn either Mandarin or Cantonese, I would learn Mandarin. Cantonese is more restricted to Hong Kong and maybe like local areas, but not large areas in China. More like Chinatown in New York or San Diego, San Francisco, those big areas. But Mandarin can be used worldwide, and Mandarin's kind of like the big Chinese dialect, so you can use that businesses or just talking in general when you go to China. If I was to identify myself through Chinese language, through Cantonese or Mandarin, I don't think it's hindered me that much. I think the only time I ever really felt anything was then my Chinese class in high school had visitors from our sister school in China, and they kind of expected me to know Chinese fluently in a way, so they kind of came to me first, since they weren't comfortable with going to the other more American looking students in my class. So when they like spoke Chinese to me, I had to say I didn't speak it fluently, so they were kind of taken back by that. I think that was more of a surprise to me that they would come to me first and expect that, if anything. I personally don't think that it should be expected of them to know, of Chinese Americans to know, because being American-born Chinese, you're in America, something like this. Asians are such a high percentage now at this point in age. Like, I personally don't think so, that it shouldn't hinder you in society. I mean, I don't think it's more of a negative thing. It's more that I miss out. Not knowing the language is not really a negative thing. It's more of missing out on opportunities. I think that's the good way to put it, because then had I known Mandarin a lot, I could go around New York or San Francisco, Chinatown, and get things whenever I wanted. But I don't speak either Mandarin or Cantonese enough to converse with those people who speak it not only fast but fluently. So yeah, I guess I miss out on connections maybe that I could have, and opportunities that I also could have. Yeah, I think significance would be more opportunity-based in American-born Chinese or American-born Asian in general. That's basically it. I think if anything, it's more of being born there that defines your authenticity, and then being engulfed by that culture, that system of being raised, that education system, that social structure. I think that, if anything, defines it instead of the language. So even if, because I've known some people who grew up in China, but they were raised in an American family, so they more had the mindset of being Chinese, or just being in that system, so where they had to take Chinese classes to learn it, However, their mindset in the way of life or the way they identify themselves is more of a Chinese-based system. If I was to answer that without thinking, I would say they aren't as authentic, yes. But if they embrace it, they kind of, if they're Chinese or American-born Chinese, then yes, they have heritage in that too. So they could maybe learn more from ancestors, go back, and maybe look into their history, and that yes, they'll be more authentic. But I don't think they'd be as authentic as someone who is from that originating country. Straight on, I think that if you don't know the language, you are a little bit less authentic. Where in comparison to being born and raised there. So if you were to embrace something other than language, such as dancing, singing, food, you can kind of embrace that even without understanding language. That's the most important part. So you can go to a performance in the streets of some local area that might be Chinese based, and you can kind of get the feel for it, and you don't need to learn language at all. You can kind of listen, you can kind of get the feel, you can understand how those people communicate with each other and how they celebrate their culture. And I feel like that makes you a little bit more authentic than just knowing the language. I personally don't feel like an authentic Chinese, yes, because of language, but more because my parents raised me that way. Sure, they raised me on their mindset, which was kind of tougher, and stereotypically many people classify that as Asian kind of being raised. My parents did kind of pressure me a little bit to be more Asian by taking me out to dinners that had my relatives who are from China and celebrate in that way through dinners, through mooncake festivals, things like that. However, I was never really raised in a setting of Asian Americans, so I don't think that pressure has ever been onto me. I was more raised in a Caucasian kind of society, so that pressure, no, but my family, yes. My grandparents especially too, they would constantly remind me that like they did this, they did that in China, and that I should learn those ways too. I don't think the pressures that my grandparents put on for me to succeed in one thing or the other, I don't think it was never based on me just being Chinese American that I would never be able to do it. It was either my own goals or what I thought I could do. It was never hindered by me just not being fully Chinese or being legitimate. When I was raised through whatever pressures they would put on me, it was never based on being Chinese. It was simply based on succeed in what you want to do, succeed in this, succeed in that. So those factors never really came into play. In my school system, there were so few Asian Americans or Asian in general that I never really had the problem of identifying this or identifying that. It was more just I was accepted. Yeah, I don't think I ever felt not accepted. I mean, they did strive to make me learn it because I was put through Chinese school every Sunday. Well, not put through. I didn't hate it. Because at that point it was like, sure, I'll do this, but it was never something they would keep pressuring me on. They would never say, you must do this, you must do that for your heritage. It was never for your heritage. It's just, this will help you. I think what they said was, this will help you in the future. This will only benefit you. So, yeah, that never really negatively impacted me. And going to Sunday school for Chinese also never impacted the way I fit into society. Because I would never, at that age, in elementary, intermediate school, I would never speak that Chinese. If anything, it would only be to my parents, just for practice. And even then, in my household, I would speak Cantonese only. So that Mandarin, at that point, didn't really mean anything to me. Not, like, literally nothing. It was just a matter of learning it. Well, the way the classes went, it was every Sunday you would learn a little bit. So I think I can hold solid conversations with people, but if they were to go in depth about, I don't know, history or something like that, I wouldn't be able to understand. I wouldn't be able to, like, have an active conversation with them. I would be able to live my everyday life, I feel, if I was to live in China, in mainland China, but that would be it. I wouldn't be able to, I don't know, be a business person or anything like that. That would require higher understanding of the language. Because I never spoke Cantonese or Mandarin outside of my household in these 18 years. Maybe friend groups could be based around, I'm hypothesizing, I would think maybe yes. I think that might be an issue because people maybe build friendships on how well they can communicate with each other, how they can relate. So maybe people who are fluent in Chinese, maybe that's their first language, they may start to introduce themselves through that language, and say they find someone who can't really speak it. It might be harder to communicate, therefore harder to make the friendships, and harder to become better friends. So that might affect the way they get accepted into society. So yes, if it was a Chinese American dominated society that spoke Chinese as their first language.